Okay, thank you. So first of all, thanks so much to Ursula and everyone who's contributed to organizing this event. I'm very happy to be part of this conversation with you all. I am speaking to you today from Guelph in Ontario, Canada, residing on the ancestral lands of the Attawandaron, the Anishinaabe, and the Haudenosaunee peoples, and the treaty lands and territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit. These and other First Peoples have stewarded this land and continue to do so today in keeping with the dish with one spoon wampum. I'm going to talk from the position of having been engaged with infrastructure for intersectional feminist purposes since the later 1990s. I want to think about what it means to create platforms for digital knowledge production and dissemination, and especially what we might call platforming or replatforming in several senses. About platforming and the affordances for redressing historical or historically understood or misrepresented groups, replatforming, as in repetition and rebuilding, the need of platforms for care and repair, and re-platforming as a contrast to deplatforming, which is to say the need for critical analysis of the implications of providing a new platform to existing data. This is early and quite speculative thinking about platforms and their implications for digital humanities. Platforms are under-theorized and complicated artifacts, as Benjamin Bratton argues, with connotations from their etymological roots of a plateau or stage, a plot that positions characters to perform alleged choices, which are in fact predetermined, and a policy statement of a political party. Bratton resists assigning platforms any ideological or political function per se in relation to structures of power, claiming that an ideal platform is like an empty diagram through which users mediate new and archived information. My sense of platforms emerges from work on 3 digital humanities projects, 2 explicitly funded as infrastructure. They're smaller than those that Bratton invokes, and neither is governmental nor corporate, like the ones he tends to mention. Yet they match many characteristics that he assigns to platforms, and the last 2 fulfill conventional definitions of the term. I tend to assign greater political force to DH research and dissemination platforms, at least than Bratton does, but these are preliminary thoughts, and I really welcome any input on them from a critical infrastructure perspective that you may have, not least because replatforming data has become a live issue in Links, the 3rd of these projects. So let me dig into the complexities of one aspect of what Alan Liu has called the diversity stack. So the 3 projects that I'm talking about are, first of all, the Orlando Project, which is a feminist literary history of women's writing in the British Isles that started in 1995 and is still active. The Quirk platform, the Canadian Writing Research Collaboratory, which launched in 2016, which was a rebuild and expansion of the Orlando backend production system. It serves as a virtual research environment for a wide range of projects. And you'll see that there's a video if you're looking at the YouTube channel, and hear from Mihaela Ilaban, Quirk's assistant director, in the project session. We're now building Quirk's next generation. And then finally, the linked infrastructure for networked cultural scholarship, which you heard about a little bit from Laura Mandel, which is converting existing data sets to linked open data and making them available through various interfaces, although these will not form a single unified platform of the type that Quirk is. These projects and my reflections here would be impossible without the work and critical contributions of many people. All 3 sites have respective credit pages, but I'm going to mention a few individuals particularly connected to this work over the course of this talk. So, first, I want to talk about platforming. I started my career as a digital humanist before the term existed in recuperative mode with the Orlando Project. It was all about making women visible, addressing the gaps and suppressions in narratives literary history through a capacious and generous treatment of women writers. Jacqueline Warnemont, in her assessment of feminist interventions in digital literary archives, critiqued celebrations of size, impact, and productivity, and instead valorized blurred boundaries and the generative possibilities of interpretive markup. The encoding of aspects of identity such as race, ethnicity, religion, and class and gender marks, in Warnemont's view, within Orlando, a kind of transformative intervention that invites speculation of alternative interventions. Although far and away the majority of the writers in Orlando are white women, the project worked hard to devise a means of encoding differences, refusing to let whiteness operate as a silent and uncontested norm against which the smaller number of BIPOC writers were defined. Differences needed to be recognized, articulated, and encoded, even if that led to discomfort in the tagging and the taggers. So the platform was interventionist in this sense. It was transparent about the markup and the constructedness of the narratives that it was offering and creating. It countered some of the problematic implications of, among other things, platforming individual or individualist biocritical profiles. Recognizing its complexity, let's put a pin in that notion of platforming as a means of amplifying marginalized voices, underrepresented content, and non-hegemonic perspectives that remains powerful, as noted by Miriam Posner, and move on to thinking about the next sense of platforming. Replatforming. The Orlando project, as it continued to grow following its publication in 2006, brought home the second sense of replatforming, the need for care and repair, and eventually rebuild of infrastructure. There's been a great deal written on this topic, both within and beyond the digital humanities, including by Bethany Novitzky, Dot Porter, Mark Sample, and Lisa Goddard and her colleagues on the Endings Project. Stephen J. Jackson rightly stresses care as an ethical proposition that breaks down the subject-object relations between humans and things. And this challenge to hierarchical relations, I've argued, has gendered implications for infrastructural service. But what I want to amplify here, very briefly, is that replatforming suggests the Sisyphean nature of infrastructure, the need to repair and eventually rebuild in the context of the great difficulty in most academic funding contexts of obtaining the resources to sustain and then, as technology requires it, to rebuild as opposed to creating something fully new, and the typical precariousness of academic infrastructures. That mandates high levels of administrative work, including but not solely related to writing frequent grant proposals for scarce resources. This creates friction for infrastructural interventions in terms of the labor and creativity it consumes and by discouraging risk. The larger and more established an infrastructure, the greater the friction against design thinking, as it's often called. Design thinking in this context is not impossible, as Tara McPherson, I think, has shown with the Scalar platform, but this friction is a factor to which I will return. But before that, I want to talk about replatforming. I hyphenate this version of replatforming to indicate a pause that should surround the choice to platform or not. Replatforming can be quite straightforward. For instance, it can be data rescue of the kind that Quirk did in ingesting, with the permission of the creator, a massive body of bibliographic data of early Canadian cultural periodical literature that was, stuck on a CD-ROM and was going to be lost. But Quirk encountered fairly early on the complexity of platforming data involving living persons in T.L. Cowan and Jasmine Rowe's Cabaret Commons project. T.L. had planned an online archive and anecdotal encyclopedia for trans, feminist, and queer artists, activists, and audiences. A community-based and community-sourced anti-archive designed to capture the ephemera of the queer cabaret scene. Their speculative exploration, however, led to a true anti-archive. It stayed dark as they worked through the ethics of a highly complex project, for instance, in co-directing the Digital Research Ethics Collaboratory and co-authoring the Feminist Data Manifest No, which takes a strong stance on data use, for instance, viewing data about people as fundamentally personal, tactical, and temporary. They say we refuse the use of data about people in perpetuity. We commit to embracing agency and working with intentionality, preparing bodies or corpuses of data to be laid to rest when they are not being used in service of the people about whom they were created. Replatforming in this sense involves taking existing information that has already been made public in some form or other, print or digital or performance, and migrating it to another platform. As the hyphen or pause indicates, this is not a trivial undertaking, and we have increasing awareness of the potential harm that it can cause. Debates over the right to be forgotten center on the right of the living to be excised from web representations and records, but even for those who are no longer living, powerful arguments have been advanced about the high and potentially harmful stakes of representation or replatforming. Thus, although the DH community hugely prizes open access, there is increasing consciousness that in some cases openness can replicate violence and trauma associated with racism, colonialism, and other forms of oppression. You're going to hear me echoing Alan in a couple of ways as I go forward. Kim Christian and her colleagues have advanced infrastructural support for Indigenous communities by introducing traditional knowledge labels. These customizable metadata labels can be operationalized within a platform such as Mukurtu to guide who should have access to what content under what circumstances. More recently, the CARE principles for Indigenous data governance have emerged to complement the FAIR principles for open data, recognizing the tension between openness and data sovereignty by Indigenous peoples. In some cases, such as hate speech, Temi Odumosu argues simple refusal to give an image further prominence or validity via reproduction on a platform may be the best answer. Such a position is consistent with that taken belatedly by major social media platforms to ban the instigators of the insurrection in the wake of the assault on the US Capitol, and recognizes that denying access to a platform is not synonymous with censorship, nor is it compatible with preserving evidence of instigation in the interests of accountability and the historical record. Jessica Marie Johnson lays out the painful tension between the historical record and the needs of the present in her analysis of the complicity of digital design and implementation with the commodification of Black bodies. And yet, despite the horror, she notes the power and empowerment of the transatlantic slave trade database in reshaping the study of slavery by filling in the gap, to some extent, a small extent, but still a significant extent, left by women and children in the historical record, even though it was with the smallest traces of material existence, such as fractions of currency that marked their bondage and sale. So this is the context in which I want to raise the question of replatforming via links. Links is all about replatforming through linked open data. It's about taking existing data sets and putting them on the web. And it has a strong commitment to working against systemic bias and oppression in how we do it, as articulated in the ontology policies document that our ontology specialist, Erin Canning, has produced in consultation with the ontology working group. Converting data to linked open data is platforming, and I would say it's platforming with a distance, insofar as the form of linked open data, the technical stack on which it's built, relies on disambiguation, which Laura mentioned earlier. Disambiguation is the ability to represent people or other entities uniquely on the web so as to link them up. That's the fundamental value proposition of linked open data. So a vital step in that conversion is disambiguation, the assignment of unique identifiers to everyone, or most everyone, or some of the people, there are choices, represented in the data, which could in some cases go some step towards the kind of replatforming that Johnson calls for, a digital practice based in affect as well as trauma that requires researchers to witness and remark on the marked and unmarked bodies, the ones that defy computation, and find ways to hold the null values up to the light. Null values are a challenge that we might consider how linked data might work to insert traces of the marginalized back into the historical record, to counter as far as possible the structures of the archive. Indeed, I think we're going to hear about the Enslaved Project and how it's using linked open data towards inclusive and reparative ends. Yet one can see precisely how disambiguation could be deeply problematic in the context of queer identities. Tara Robertson's blog post digitization, just because you can doesn't mean you should, takes up precisely this scenario in the context of the lesbian porn magazine On Our Backs. If it was one thing to agree to be represented in a small-sized, small print-run zine that circulated within a subculture in the early 1990s, and another to be represented in a digitized version of the same content on the web, which is what Robertson is talking about, imagine adding a unique identifier that links people in that zine to their current identities, or links two quite discrete personas from different contexts in their lives in ways that they might not assent to and that could actually be dangerous for them. Triangulation would enable
sorry, 1 minute left, I'm sorry.
All right. Triangulation would enable search systems to find not only the link between the two identities, but almost certainly to associated materials, other people in their familial, social, and employment networks, and so on. So the Links project finds itself faced with the big ethical questions involved in providing a new platform for historical or contemporary materials imbued with racism, sexism, and classism. The ethics reviews mandated by Canadian funding agencies cover only initial data creation and not questions related to the remediation of data. So what does it mean to put this kind of data in linked data form to re-platform it? We're going to be thinking about this, Erin Canning and I, Kim Martin as the research board chair, and Sarah Roger as project manager, and other members of the project in connection with the Ethics and Linked Data Affinity Group that's part of the LD4 project. In the meantime, I'll just mention that Orlando has had a bit of a small but significant use case of sorts in looking at how to tag trans identities. We do have a way of encoding trans identities, but in light of the controversy over whether women, whether trans women are women, that J.K. Rowling sort of spurred on in social media, we decided not to put this in the faceting of the interface, even though it could be found by searching within the text space, because we felt it would not be an inclusive way of representing the data. So people are findable, they're registerable, we are tracking them and making them accessible to people who are looking for them, but we're not separating them out, which we think would be discursively harmful. So I'm not going to talk further about the kind of friction I was talking about earlier, since we're running out of time. I will just mention that this whole aspiration of holding null values up to light, I think, could be addressed by linked open data, but Johnson talks very eloquently about that tension between the harm of the data and the need to have it. And this is a fantastic project if you're interested in looking at ways that what they call relational presence can be built into an infrastructure. I would suggest looking at the video. The site is down right now for the Digital Oral Histories for Reconciliation project. And it's very much my hope that if Links can negotiate this tension carefully and transparently, that we too will be able to have interfaces that are collaborative and respond to these sorts of needs in our communities of users. So thanks so much, and I look forward to the conversation.